In this video, I will be performing and discussing the Prelude and Fugue in C-sharp minor from the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier by Johann Sebastian Bach. In my discussion, I want to concentrate on issues of performance in terms of the prelude, although these ideas apply to the fugue as well. More specifically, I will concentrate on two performing aspects. First, ways of articulating musical ideas, and second, using dislocation, that is, the right hand and left hand not being completely in sync with one another, as a means of heightening expression. Starting with the very beginning of the prelude, we have a musical idea whose components are going to influence the musical content of the entire piece. So in terms of performing decisions, what we choose to do here, or to put it another way, how we choose to shape this musical idea, is going to inform the overall approach. This musical idea consists of a mostly stepwise descending pattern, followed by an octave leap, which here is approached via an arpeggiation, and then another stepwise descent to the note we started. Let me show you what I mean by that. This is the idea, and this is in the right hand. And if I leave the thirds out, so we start on G sharp, and we end again on G sharp. This idea is stated 4 times, alternating between the two hands, although in the fourth appearance, we get a little surprising twist regarding the leap. Let me show you what I mean by that. And now I will play the entire texture. So I hope you notice what is happening. We have this alternation of this idea. And the little surprise that I mentioned is this one at the end here. Because suddenly, instead of the octave leap, we have a leap of a seventh. And I really think that a performer should somehow respond to this surprise and highlight it for the listener. What I choose to do here, and you may have heard it already, is to slightly slow down that moment because it needs a little extra time to be savored. And what this means is that I hesitate ever so slightly to start the arpeggiation, and then I slow down the arpeggiation itself, and finally I linger a little longer on the final chord before moving on. Let me play again this beginning, and I will slightly exaggerate the effect that I make so that you can hear it. Etc., etc. Now, let's get back to the original musical idea, and first, let's look at the initial 6-note descent, in other words this. In terms of articulating this gesture, I have two different patterns in mind. First, in terms of overall shape, I emphasize the beginning of the gesture, and I do this by holding the first note as long as possible, even as I begin to play the second note. So again, a slight exaggeration, but something like this. And then I kind of lighten up the remaining notes. The second pattern is to think of these 6 notes in groups of 2, where the first note of each group is slightly more important than the second note. And again, I'm exaggerating a little bit so that you can perceive it more easily. Now, if we combine both of these ideas, we can get something like this maybe. And let me play again maybe the beginning of the piece again, so now you can hear a little more what I'm doing with these ideas. It is important to emphasize, and I hope you heard this as I was playing, that I regard these patterns and the way I apply them in a flexible way, like articulation motives, so to speak, which I can vary and also choose how to combine them, which one to emphasize more, etc. In other words, just like Bach is going to vary his musical ideas, I am similarly going to vary how I approach these ideas. And a lot of what I'm doing is also going to be different from performance to performance. The second aspect of performance I wanted to discuss is that of dislocation, which, as I mentioned previously, involves the 2 hands not being in sync with one another. I think that if you follow the score as you listen to the performance, you will notice that I apply dislocation in different degrees throughout the piece, although for me, this is one of those expressive devices that can never be completely planned out beforehand. However, there is one particular gesture in the piece where, just like with the patterns I'm using when it comes to groups of 6/8 notes, I am deliberately using dislocation to heighten expression. This is the leap that is part of the initial musical idea. So as we saw, this leap starts out spanning the interval of an octave, but Bach is already modifying it by its 4th appearance. And as the piece progresses, there are going to be a couple of special moments where this leap is going to extend beyond the span of an octave. Although it depends on the context, I would argue that a wide leap can be rendered more expressive when the arrival of the second note is delayed, because this way a performer can highlight the space between the notes by spreading it out in time. Let me show you what I mean by looking at a couple of passages. First, let's look at measures 9 and 10, where the leap becomes a minor 9th. And let me start a little earlier. And it's right here. So we do this, a minor 9th. And what I do is I'm going to delay the arrival of the A. So let me play that passage again. And the second passage I want to talk about is around measure 25, where we reach a B sharp, which is the highest note in the entire piece. So this is a very expressive moment. And again, I'm going to delay the arrival of the B sharp in the right hand, but the trick, as always, is for the left hand to maintain a more or less strict tempo. So it's not just that the right hand plays after the left hand, but crucially, that the right hand arrives after the beat. So let me start again a little earlier. Let me find a good place to start, okay? So that one, and again, I hope you noticed that I tried to keep the left hand pretty much on time, and then I really delayed the arrival of the right hand. Finally, a few words about the temperament I'm using, or to put it another way, a disclaimer about the temperament I'm using. One thing that should not be debatable is the type of temperament Bach had in mind for the Well-Tempered Clavier. The title of Bach's collection implies the use of a well-temperament, also called a circulating temperament, meaning an unequal temperament in which all tonalities are playable. This characteristic makes well-temperaments similar to equal temperament, but there is one crucial distinction. In well-temperaments, each tonality has its own distinctive color because intervals are not tempered equally. The point of contention has to do with whether Bach had a particular well-temperament in mind, and if so, what that would be. Obviously, I cannot fully present the various arguments here, but if I were to somewhat simplify the issue, I would say we can look at a couple of different sources. And first of all, for instance, we could look at the historical evidence regarding the types of well-temperaments circulating, that was a bad pun, around Bach's milieu. And then we can also look at how Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, in his essay on the true art of playing keyboard instruments, how he describes tuning. And if we look at those sources, then it is highly likely that the type of well-temperament Bach would have used consisted of a combination of pure and tempered fifths, with all major thirds tempered. In other words, no major third would be pure. And this brings us to the temperament I am using for this performance, which is Kirnberger III. Technically speaking, this is indeed a well-temperament, and yes, Kirnberger was one of Bach's students. However, Kirnberger III is also a peculiar well-temperament because Kirnberger decided to retain one pure major third, which is between the notes C and E. Now, doing this, in other words, retaining this pure major third, requires a different adjustment when it comes to the fifths as well as the remaining thirds. And there are musicians that will criticize this temperament for not managing to accommodate every single tonality successfully. In other words, there are certain chords that some musicians perceive as sounding too harsh. Personally speaking, what I like about this temperament is precisely the fact that it retains a pure major third. I am very partial to pure major thirds. And of all the well-temperaments I have tried, this is the one that seems to be somewhat closer to my favorite Rameau temperament, which incidentally also has a pure third between C and E. As for some chords sounding too harsh, this is something that at least I haven't perceived when I've used it. And as a matter of fact, I would argue that this temperament tends to be a little more colorful and eventful compared to the other well-temperaments I have tried. And that's something that I personally like. I also think that in terms of this particular Prelude and Fugue, Kirnberger III matches the music's expressive character. But obviously, this is purely my personal preference, and I simply wanted to make clear that I'm making no claims that this is a temperament that Bach would have used. It's simply one that I have decided to use for this performance. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance.